Los Angeles, March 1965. The recording studio on Sunset Boulevard was silent, except for the hum of equipment. Gregory Peck sat in the soundproof booth, script pages spread before him, reading glasses catching the light. The words were about John F. Kennedy, about a presidency cut short, about a funeral 16 months past. Outside the glass, George Stevens Jr. stood with arms crossed. The young producer who had convinced the United States Information Agency to let Gregory narrate their memorial documentary. Beside him, Bruce Hirschensohn, the film's director and composer, leaned forward listening through the monitors. They had been recording since noon, moving through Kennedy's presidency piece by piece. Gregory had read through sections about the Peace Corps volunteers Kennedy sent around the world, about the Cuban Missile Crisis when the world held its breath for 13 October days. In 1962, about Berlin, where Kennedy stood at the wall and declared himself a citizen of that besieged city. His voice, that deep baritone that could command a courtroom or comfort a child, that had defined Atticus Finch 3 years earlier, and now carried the responsibility of defining a fallen president, had moved through the script with measured authority. But now they had reached page 47, the section about Dallas, about November 22nd, 1963. Gregory's jaw tightened. His hand went to his glasses, removed them, cleaned them slowly with the corner of his shirt, a gesture that betrayed an uncertainty he would never voice aloud. Have you ever had to speak about a loss so public that your grief became everyone's grief, so shared that it stopped belonging to you alone? Wait, because what happened in the next 20 minutes would become a story told in whispers. A moment when Gregory Peck, the man who had played Atticus Finch, who had stood for moral certainty on screen and off, who had marched for civil rights and challenged the blacklist, found himself unable to speak certain truths aloud. Not because they weren't true, but because speaking them would make them too real, would turn private grief into public performance. Stevens had chosen Gregory carefully for this project, had known from the start that this film needed a voice that carried moral authority without self-righteousness, intelligence without condescension, grief without sentimentality. The documentary was meant for international audiences, a tribute to Kennedy's 1,000 days in office, a film that would show the world that America's ideals survived Dallas, that the torch had been passed and would keep burning despite the darkness of assassination. But Congress had decreed that USIF films could not be shown on American soil, a strange prohibition rooted in propaganda fears from another era. A rule that made this memorial invisible to the very citizens who mourned most deeply, who had stood in their living rooms watching Walter Cronkite remove his glasses and announce the unthinkable: American tax dollars would create a film about an American president that Americans themselves could not see in their own theaters. The irony was not lost on anyone in that studio, least of all Gregory, who understood what it meant to have your voice heard everywhere except home. Gregory knew that foreign audiences and embassies from Santo Domingo to Ghana, from Rome to Tokyo, would see this before Americans could, if Americans ever could. He also knew that his voice would carry the impossible weight of explaining the inexplicable, of making sense of senselessness. In the booth, Gregory picked up the script again, felt the weight of the pages. Bruce's words were poetic, precise. History will pick up its cold pen and book and write in chronological order the events of the day with the date and time and the city. But history will be wrong, for there wasn't one date, or time, or city. Gregory read the line once in his head, felt its rhythm, its truth, then put the script down and looked at his hands. Those large hands that had held so many scripts, played so many scenes. Through the glass, Stevens pressed the intercom button. The electronic clicked loud in the quiet. "Mr. Peck, whenever you're ready." Take your time, Gregory nodded without looking up. The next section covered the funeral procession. The caisson through Washington. The riderless horse, the widow in black lighting an eternal flame at Arlington. Standard narrations. Until Gregory's eyes returned to Bruce's handwritten note, inviting him to step from narrator into witness and speak of what Kennedy had meant. When have you been asked to speak about someone you admired, only to realize words diminish what you felt?
Gregory pressed the intercom button. The click decisive. Bruce, George. Could you come in here for a moment? It wasn't a question. Stevens and Hershenson exchanged glances, then entered. 3 men in that small space, 2 in their early 30s, one 48 years old looking older under the harsh studio light. Gregory kept his voice low. I've read your script, Bruce. It's good. It's dignified. It's exactly what this film needs. But this section here, he tapped the margin note, where you want me to add my own reflections. I can't do that. Stevens started to speak, but Gregory raised one hand. Let me explain why. You've written a memorial. You've documented a presidency. That's correct. That's important. But if I start talking about what I personally felt about President Kennedy, about watching those horses walk through Washington, about seeing Caroline kneel by that coffin, about thinking of my own children, this stops being your documentary and becomes my grief. And my grief is private. Hershenson looked at Gregory. But Mr. Peck, that personal connection is what will make this resonate with audiences. Gregory removed his glasses again, rubbed the bridge of his nose. Bruce, you're 32 years old. You're brilliant at this work, but the power in this film is in Jack Kennedy's own words and letting audiences see him speak, see him move, see him think. The moment I inject myself into that, I become the story instead of the vessel for his story. He gestured toward the control room. You have footage of his inaugural address. You have him in Berlin. You have him talking about civil rights. Let that be the memorial. My job is to hold the space, not fill it. Stevens understood George. If I may, Gregory continued, even quieter. There's another reason. If I start talking about my personal feelings about civil rights, about Kennedy's courage facing down governors and senators, then I'm making this about my causes, my beliefs. And the moment I do that, half your audience stops listening. They hear Gregory Peck's politics instead of John Kennedy's presidency. I won't do that to this film. I won't do that to his memory. The booth was silent. Bruce finally spoke, but won't it feel cold? Just facts and dates if there's no emotion. Gregory turned to face him directly. Bruce, I'm gonna read your script with every bit of precision and feeling I have. But the feeling won't be about me. It will be in service to the words, to the images, to Kennedy's own voice. That's what emotion means here. Not my tears, the tears of everyone watching. Not my grief. Their grief. I'm not the story, I'm just the voice that helps them remember. Stevens made a decision. We'll do it your way. Mr. Peck. Gregory nodded, returned to his seat. The 2 younger men left the booth. What would you do if asked to give testimony when silence might honor the dead more fully? When have you watched someone choose restraint over recognition? Recording resumed. Gregory's voice came through the monitors. And it was true the president was killed, but it was also true that the assassin missed his target. For he wanted John Kennedy to die, and that he was unable to do. For no man can take away years of lightning with a single day of drums. When Gregory finished that line, Stevens noticed. Hershenson's shoulders shaking, tears running down his face. The engineer pulled out a handkerchief. But in the booth, Gregory simply turned the page, his voice never breaking, letting Bruce's words and Kennedy's legacy speak without interference. They finished 2 hours later. Gregory emerged, shook hands. George, Bruce, thank you. It's an important film. He left without ceremony. Stevens and Hershenson sat as the reel spun down. He refused to make it about himself, Bruce said. Every instinct for an actor is to seize the moment, own the scene. He gave it away. Stevens nodded.
That's why we asked him, do you remember when you've seen someone's greatest strength revealed not in what they said, but in what they chose not to say?
The documentary premiered at American embassies in 1965, shown to diplomats before any American could see it in Santo Domingo. Diplomatic families watched it on the ambassador's lawn. In Ghana, audiences cried. The film was named one of the 10 best films of 1965 despite not being shown in American theaters. Finally, in 1966, Congress passed special legislation allowing the single-use film to be screened domestically. The only time such an exception had been made. When Americans finally saw it, they heard Gregory Peck's voice guiding them through Kennedy's presidency. But they never heard Gregory Peck's opinions, his politics, his personal grief. They heard a narrator who had stepped aside to let history speak. Years later, Persian Song would tell the story, explaining what the most powerful moment wasn't any footage they found. He was watching Gregory Peck refuse to use a president's death to elevate his own voice, Stevens, who went on to produce the Kennedy Center Honors, would say he learned more about artistic restraint in that recording booth than in years of film school. The lesson was simple but profound. Sometimes the greatest service you can give is to get out of the way. Gregory himself never discussed possession publicly. When asked about the documentary, he would say only that Bruce Hirschenson had written a beautiful script, and that Kennedy's own words needed no embellishment. But those who were in the studio that March day carried the memory. They'd watched a man at the height of his fame, a man who had won an Oscar playing the conscience of America, choose to be a conduit rather than a commentator, a voice rather than a verdict. When have you watched someone choose restraint over recognition? What would Hollywood mean if more people understood that sometimes not saying something is the most powerful statement you can make? This is what Hollywood used to mean. Not just stardom, but understanding your role, not just talent, but knowing when talent means stepping aside. If you remember when actors served the story rather than using the story to serve themselves, when dignity and restraint and power met knowing what not to say. This channel preserves those moments. Share this with someone who understands that the hardest performances are the ones where you don't perform at all, where you simply bear witness. Like this, if you believe some truths are too important to be filtered to personal opinion, subscribe to keep these stories alive, these moments when Hollywood's greatest talents chose greatness over glory. And tell us in the comments, have you ever had to speak about something so significant but your own feelings seemed inadequate? And silence honored the moments better than eloquence? Have you watched someone choose to be invisible so something important could be seen? Every memory of restraint matters. Every example of dignity over display deserves to be remembered.